October 14th, 1959. An apartment in Vancouver, Canada. On Dr. Grant Gould's bed lay a body that had just gone cold. There were no red carpet camera flashes. There were no screams of adoring fans. There was only the scent of medical fluids and the ruthless silence of death. That corpse belonged to a man named Errol Flynn, the greatest idol in the history of adventure films, the absolute symbol of masculinity on the 20th century silver screen, the undefeated Robin Hood who once made millions of women swoon. But that was on the screen. On the autopsy table, the truth laid bare an entirely different story. When the forensic pathologist conducted the autopsy, the lengthy medical report returned reading like an inventory list from a scrapyard. His birth certificate recorded that this man had just crossed the age of 50. However, the physiology of the corpse belonged to an old man over 75. It was a body comprehensively rotting from the inside out. The direct cause of death was recorded as a myocardial infarction. Simply put, his heart had stopped beating because there was no longer enough blood pumping through the dense atherosclerotic plaques. But that was just the final period to a process of destruction that had been ongoing for a very long time. The records noted that his liver suffered from full-blown cirrhosis. A healthy liver is soft and deep red. The liver inside Errol Flynn's chest at that time was swollen, stiff as a rock, and had completely lost its ability to filter toxins after decades of being submerged in industrial alcohol and hard liquor. It did not stop there. The corpse's spine bore the marks of severe degeneration and micro-traumas. His intestinal tract was ulcerated. The muscles that once swung swords on pirate ships were now shriveled and flabby. That was the final state of an icon. When you type Errol Flynn's name into film archives, the returned results are always brilliantly restored 4K frames. A deeply arrogant half smile, a perfectly trimmed mustache, a sword raised beneath the blazing California sun. But that was not the real man. That was a commercial product. An illusion meticulously designed by Hollywood's capitalist class. They did not sell Errol Flynn. They sold a mirage. And when that illusion began to crack due to illness and pressure, instead of providing a life-saving medical safety net, this industrial machine forced him to drink his own blood, draining every last drop of his vitality to keep the paint job shiny before the camera. His death at 50 was not a personal tragedy caused by a reckless lifestyle. It was the inevitable outcome of a process that exploited human resources down to the marrow. Let's travel back in time. Bunyan returned to 1935. America was sinking into the deep abyss of the Great Depression. Millions were unemployed, starving, and desperate. They needed an escape. And Jack L. Warner, the mogul of Warner Brothers, knew exactly how to sell that escape to them for the price of 25 cents a movie ticket. Warner Brothers was struggling with their blockbuster project, Captain Bled. The actor targeted for the leading role had dropped out. In a highly risky, yet carefully calculated gamble, the studio elites decided to push an unknown Australian actor, devoid of real acting experience, into the leading spot. That man was Errol Flynn. That bet changed the history of Hollywood's cash flow. Captain Bled swept the global box office. Overnight, Flynn went from a nobody to the most highly liquid asset in America. The Warner Brothers elite instantly recognized a gold mine. They initiated a campaign of molding. They redesigned his identity. Every camera angle, the intensity of the lighting, the tilt of his chin, and even the way he smoothed his shirt folds. Everything was optimized to depict a flawless superhero. Do you think Errol Flynn was naturally that charming? No. That was the handiwork of hundreds of lighting experts, makeup artists, and top-tier scriptwriters working day and night to create a perfect visual hallucination. But the price of that perfection was a slave contract. In the studio system of that era, actors signed a type of 7-year, exclusive contract. This legal jargon sounds professional, but simply put, the studio owned you. They owned your face, your voice, your time, and even the right to decide who you would romance in the tabloids. You had no right to choose your scripts. You had no right to refuse a 16-hour daily shooting schedule. You were a fixed asset on the corporate balance sheet. We are talking about an extreme ROI, return on investment. Put bluntly, it was the canyon between the spare change they paid him and the mountains of gold they raked in. Subsequent blockbusters like The Charge of the Light Brigade, 1936, Or The Adventures of Robin Hood, 1938, brought in tens of millions of dollars in net profit. Meanwhile, Flynn's contracted salary was pinned to the floor. He enriched the executive board, while he himself began to sink into massive debt just to maintain the lavish lifestyle that the studio itself required him to parade before the public. And here is the most terrifying part: his rebellion. Errol Flynn drank recklessly. Errol Flynn got into bar fights. Errol Flynn was drowning in debt. The cinematic capitalist syndicate knew it all. But instead of intervening or sending him to rehab, the studio's media apparatus turned that very degradation into a marketing campaign. They twisted his vices, whitewashed them in the press, and slapped him with the label of a lovable rogue. Audiences bought tickets because they liked a man who ignored the rules. The power system tolerated the destruction of Flynn's body because that destruction sold tickets. They turned a man's addiction and psychological instability into a brand identity feature. As long as the actor could still stand upright when action was called, the fact that he was vomiting blood in his dressing room afterward was not a risk factor the board of directors needed to care about. Behind the arrogant smiles on the silver screen was a body bleeding out, literally. The Warner Brothers industrial machine was not programmed to have humanity. It was configured to maximize the utility of its machinery. In Errol Flynn's contract, the filming schedule was a physically draining death sentence. 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, continuously bouncing from one film set to another. But the corporate machine had ignored a fatal variable: Flynn's medical records. Before coming to Hollywood, during his years roughing it in New Guinea, he had contracted malaria. This disease never disappeared. It lurked in his blood, triggering devastating high fevers, debilitating his entire immune system, and silently destroying his liver. Additionally, to maintain his action hero image, Flynn had to perform countless dangerous stunts himself. The result? A severe spinal injury. Microfractures in his vertebrae brought chronic pain, tearing at his nerves every time he moved. A normal human being with that pathology would need to be hospitalized. They would need a long-term treatment regimen, but Warner Brothers did not allow their product to be hospitalized. Instead of providing medical care, the capitalists shoved painkillers into his hands. They summoned doctors to the set, injected anesthetics directly into his spine, wiped the cold sweat from the actor's forehead, and shoved him back in front of the lens. Flynn started using alcohol to self-medicate his physical agony. Glasses of liquor meant to drown his sorrows turned into bottles of vodka, chugged between takes. The system's complicity began right here. They knew he was addicted, they knew he was in pain, but they chose to enable it. The climax of this calculated ignorance erupted during World War II. America called for troops. The public expected their Robin Hood to head to the battlefield. Flynn went for his military medical examination, and the result returned was a 4F classification. Simply put, the U.S. military confirmed his body was completely wrecked, carrying too many underlying conditions like malaria, spinal tuberculosis, and hidden heart failure, rendering him unfit to hold a gun. By all rights, this was the moment the truth about his health should have been publicized. But the power syndicate at the studio panicked. If the public knew their unparalleled hero was actually a crumbling, chronic patient, box office revenues would collapse. An information blockade strategy was activated. Warner Brothers buried Flynn's 4F medical files. They allowed the public to humiliate him as a coward dodging his national duty. They were willing to sacrifice his personal honor, enduring a few attack articles, as long as the illusion of a masculine, healthy man on screen remained intact to keep selling tickets. The cruelty of the Hollywood machine did not stop at destroying his health. It also twisted morality and weaponized crime. In 1942, the bomb detonated. Errol Flynn was arrested and put on trial for statutory rape. The victims were two underage girls, Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterley. For anyone else, this was a criminal charge that could lead to a life sentence and a ruined career. But for the Studio Alliance, this was merely a PR crisis management problem. The studio's most cutthroat legal team was deployed. They didn't just defend Flynn in court, they turned the entire trial into an entertainment circus. They callously crushed the dignity of the two underage victims. On the witness stand, the girls had their private lives dissected by the legal team, painted as fame-hungry opportunists taking advantage of a naive star. The media swarmed the trial like a banquet. And here is the most repulsive part. The studio's PR machine discovered that this sex scandal actually increased Flynn's appeal. The slang phrase, "in like Flynn," was born, alluding to the ability to conquer women regardless of the law. Instead of punishing his habit of exploiting young girls, the corporate apparatus whitewashed it. They turned a criminal indictment into rebellious charm. Hordes of fans gathered outside the courthouse, screaming in support of him. Flynn was acquitted. The box office returns for his films released immediately afterward skyrocketed insanely. He had become an untouchable money-printing machine, but inside, the man was utterly shattered. Acquittal did not mean freedom. Flynn sank deeper into alcoholism, drugs, and massive tax debts. He still believed the studio would protect him forever. He believed in the illusion of power they had painted. But capitalism has no heart. It only has financial statements. By the 1950s, when Flynn's face was heavily ravaged by alcoholism, when his spine collapsed, making it impossible for him to swing a sword, and when box office revenues began to plummet, the system struck. No safety net was cast out. There was no rehab center or pension fund. Warner Brothers severed his contract. The studio moguls turned their backs. The once radiant hero was tossed to the curb, buried in debt, forced to liquidate his assets and shoot cheap B-movies in Europe just to afford booze. They had leached him to his very last drop of blood, then discarded his rotting carcass when it no longer generated profit. In 1959, when Errol Flynn's heart stopped beating forever in that Vancouver apartment, a truth was exposed on legal documents. His bank account was in the negative. The Internal Revenue Service, IRS, was casting a net to hunt him down over accumulated debts reaching hundreds of thousands of dollars. Meanwhile, the films he starred in were still being broadcast continuously on national television networks. They were still generating profit every single day. Banners, images, and merchandise bearing his face were still being sold. But not a single penny from that massive waterfall of profit flowed into the pockets of the man who had just breathed his last. The cinematic capitalists held something called perpetual image rights. Simply put, they had outright bought his soul and body on screen until the end of the universe, and he had no right to demand any further cut. His body was transported back to Forest Lawn Cemetery in California. For a long time, the grave of the greatest idol who ever saved the Hollywood box office didn't even have a proper engraved headstone. Jack L. Warner and the executives of the Studio Alliance did not send flowers. They did not attend the funeral. To the corporate accounting system, Errol Flynn had become a fully depreciated asset, no longer of use, no longer requiring maintenance, and crossed off the balance sheet. A few months after his death, an autobiography titled My Wicked, Wicked Ways was published. In those final drafted pages of his life, Flynn had truly tried to scream. In disjointed words, he wrote of his ultimate emptiness, his terror, and how he loathed the masculine illusion he was forced to act out every day in front of the lens. But the industrial machine intervened once more. They did not want the public reading a cry for help. The publishing system edited, butchered, and promoted the book as an anthology of cheap Playboy exploits, a manual for a terrible romantic. Even lying 6 feet under, he was subjected to the process of posthumous exploitation. Simply put, the vultures continued to dig up your soulless corpse, remolding your story to sell books, even when you had lost all ability to defend yourself. The slang, "in like Flynn," continued to be used jokingly by the public to describe cunning seducers, permanently locking him in the black hole of degradation created by the studio itself. Today, if you open streaming platforms, you will still see the adventures of Robin Hood or the Seahawk. They have been digitally restored to 4K resolution. The green of the cape is so vibrant, the sound of clashing swords is so crisp. The leading man's half-smile remains perfectly arrogant, untroubled by a single sorrow. But look deeply into that frame. What you are admiring is not a classic cinematic masterpiece. You are staring directly at the scene of a murder. You are witnessing a cold-blooded capitalist system slowly draining the cells, spinal fluid, and organs of a human being. The the Hollywood machine committed an unprecedented act of cruelty. It didn't just push Errol Flynn to his death. It encoded his self-destruction into a dazzling legend. It brainwashed millions of audience members, forcing us to sit in the darkness of the movie theater, chewing popcorn and applauding the very process of a human being crushed to dust. Errol Flynn was never an undefeated adventure hero. He was merely a prisoner bearing a star's serial number, bled dry to the final drop, and dressed up gorgeously before being thrown onto the sacrificial altar of the entertainment industry.